Condemned to the well, the Apache woman screamed for help. Only a lone man dared to answer. She cried for help, but only one man answered. The settlement was nothing more than a cluster of weather-beaten shacks along a trading road that most riders only stopped at when they had no choice. The New Mexico sun bore down on the land, pressing dust into every crack of wood and stone. Heat shimmered on the horizon. Jonas Hale rode in at a slow pace, his limp making the sway in the saddle uneven. He had come for supplies, flour, cartridges, maybe tobacco, and nothing more. He had no ties here, no friends waiting. He rarely stayed in any place longer than it took to fill his pack. At 39, Jonas carried the weight of too many years on the frontier. A former army scout, he had lived through ambushes, long winters, and nights where the only company was the dead. A deep scar cut across his shoulder, where a Comanche lance had caught him years back, and his limp came from a musket ball lodged in his thigh since the war. People didn't look at him twice anymore. He was just another quiet drifter in a dust coat. That was how he liked it. He tied his horse outside the trading post, bought what he needed with few words, and turned back toward the road. The plan was to make camp 2 miles out near a dry wash he'd passed on the way in. He wanted to be gone before the town had a reason to notice him. Then he heard it. At first, it was faint, so faint he thought it might be the wind pulling through cracked boards. A voice. It came again, ragged, carried by air that had nowhere else to go. Jonas froze, his hand tightening on the lead rope of his horse. He listened. There was a plea, weak and trembling. Help. He followed the sound, his boots scuffing through dust, until he stood at the edge of an old well on the outskirts of town. Its stones were sun-bleached, the rope and bucket long gone. He leaned over, squinting against the glare. She was down there, a young woman Apache. By her dress and features, her dark hair tangled against her face, her skin scraped raw against the stones. She was crumpled at the bottom, one arm twisted at a wrong angle, her dress torn across the front where the fall had ripped it. Sweat clung to her, streaking the dirt on her skin. She looked up when his shadow cut the light, her lips moving again, whispering not to leave her. Jonas's jaw tightened. He knew the townsfolk he had seen their type before. If she was down there, someone had put her there. He didn't ask why, and he didn't shout for others. He knew no one would come. For a moment, he hesitated. He thought about riding on. She wasn't his responsibility. Every time he had stopped before, it had cost him blood, grief, and memories that still woke him in the dark. His past was full of voices he hadn't been able to save, but something in the way she struggled to her knees, still trying to stand, even with her arm bent useless, struck him hard. He couldn't walk away. Not again. Jonas pulled his rope free from the saddle, tied it firmly, and lowered it. His voice carried down, steady and controlled. Take hold. Use your good arm. She blinked up at him, as if unsure she could trust a stranger. Fear crossed her face, but there was no choice. She reached, her fingers trembling, as they closed around the rope. Jonas braced his boots against the stones and hauled back, every muscle tight. The rope creaked, grit tore at her palms, and she gasped with each pull. It took time, longer than he wanted. His shoulder burned, and his thigh screamed where the old wound pulled, but he didn't stop. Inch by inch, she rose, her bare feet scraping stone, her body twisting with pain. When her hand finally cleared the rim, Jonas grabbed her wrist and hauled her over, dragging her onto solid ground. She collapsed against him, breathing hard, her dress clinging in tatters. Her cleavage showed where the fabric had ripped wide, and she pulled the cloth together quickly, her eyes flashing with shame. Jonas didn't look away. He pulled his dust coat from his shoulders and draped it over her. A steady and firm gesture, not asking for permission. She went still under the weight of it, her chest heaving, sweat streaking her temple. Jonas studied her. She was young, maybe 24, no older, bruised across the cheek, her arm already swelling. Her eyes, dark and sharp even through the pain, met his with both defiance and something else relief. He let out a long breath. The question of whether to leave her behind was already gone. He couldn't, not this time. He hooked an arm under her knees, lifted her carefully despite her wince, and set her across his horse. His own legs burned with the weight, but he ignored it. She was light to light as he started leading the horse toward the hills. Jonas's thoughts remained sharp. He didn't know her name, didn't know the whole story, but he knew enough. She had been left to die, and no one else had answered her voice. That was reason enough for him. As the town shrank behind them, he felt the old, familiar weight of a decision settle in his chest, the kind you couldn't walk back from. Jonas led the horse steadily up the dry trail toward the hills, his boots dragging in the dirt with each uneven step. The woman lay slumped across the saddle, clutching his coat tight to her chest, her injured arm tucked close to her ribs. Her breathing was shallow, every bump in the ground drawing a faint wince. The sun had dropped lower, throwing long shadows over the desert floor, and Jonas knew he had only an hour before night closed in. He had no intention of keeping her near the town where she had been thrown into that well. Whatever had been done to her there, it was clear no one would care if she lived or died. He glanced up at her face as he walked, catching her eyes open now, watching him with sharp suspicion. She didn't trust him. He could see it in the way she shifted slightly away even while she relied on him to keep her steady. That was natural. He was a stranger, a white man, and the very people who had done this to her looked like him. He couldn't expect her to see the difference yet. Jonas's thoughts tightened as he walked. He wondered who exactly had carried out the act. He hadn't seen men near the well, but he could guess. Drunken hands, full of hate and fear, accusing her of theft without proof. It was easier for them to blame an Apache than look at themselves. He had seen it before in a dozen towns. Food goes missing, tools turn up gone, and the first brown-skinned face they find is guilty. The rest of the settlement looks away, too busy surviving to risk standing against the crowd. He stopped once to check her arm more closely. The joint was swollen and discolored, twisted at the elbow in a way that made his stomach turn. He thought it might be broken. She tried to pull away when he touched it, her jaw clenched against the pain, but he caught her gaze and spoke low. "It needs binding. You'll lose the use of it if it's left like this." She didn't answer, but she stopped resisting, watching him tie her arm tight against her body with strips of cloth he tore from an old feed sack. His movements were careful, steady, never lingering longer than needed, but he felt the heat of her breath when she turned her face away from him, embarrassed by her own weakness. By the time they reached his camp, the light had thinned into blue and the air had cooled. His camp was nothing more than a fire pit surrounded by stones, a lean-to built from pine branches, and a canvas roll on the ground. He had always traveled light. Tonight, it would have to serve for two. Jonas lifted her gently from the horse, setting her down near the fire pit. She was too weak to stand on her own, and her good hand clung to his sleeve before she caught herself and let go. Jonas lit the fire quickly, sparks catching dry mesquite twigs until flames spread. Shadows danced across her face, revealing the deep bruise at her temple and the raw scrapes along her collarbone. She kept adjusting the coat around her, making sure the torn fabric underneath was covered. Jonas noticed, but said nothing. He only placed a tin cup of water in her hand and waited until she drank. Water spilling against her chin, she forced it down to fast. "Name?" he asked after a long silence, his voice quiet but direct. She hesitated, her dark eyes narrowing. He could see the question forming in her mind. Why should she tell him anything? But after a pause, she answered in a rough voice, "Nyo." He nodded once. Jonas, nothing more was needed. He didn't tell her his history, didn't ask for hers. Both had scars that were plain enough without explanation. She shifted closer to the fire, the glow warming her skin. Her gaze moved over his rifle, leaning against a rock, his bedroll, the small bundle of supplies. He could almost hear her unspoken questions. Why had he helped? Why hadn't he walked away like the others? He didn't plan to explain. Still, he found himself speaking more than usual. "I heard you." That was enough. Her eyes held his for a moment longer before she looked away, pressing her lips tight. Jonas cooked a small pot of beans and shared half with her, watching carefully as she ate with her good hand. She was hungry enough to finish it all, though her pride kept her movements stiff, as though refusing to show need. When the food was gone, she leaned back against the saddle he had set behind her and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed, her body sagging with exhaustion, but she didn't let herself sleep until he settled nearby, rifle across his knees, eyes on the dark ridge. Jonas sat there long after her breathing had evened out, his thoughts heavy. He knew what this meant. By pulling her from that well, he had tied himself to her fate. The men who had dropped her there would not welcome her survival, and if they discovered he was the one who carried her out, he would be marked with her. He could leave her at first light, ride off before trouble caught him, but his gut told him he wouldn't. He couldn't walk away from her cries today, and he wouldn't be able to tomorrow either. When dawn came, the settlement would whisper, and the men who wanted her gone would stir. Jonas knew this wasn't just about one night of shelter anymore. It was the start of something else, though he wasn't ready to name it. The fire burned low when dawn broke, smoke curling in thin lines above the coals. Jonas had not slept more than a handful of minutes, his back stiff from the ground, the rifle still balanced across his lap. He had kept his eyes on the ridge through the night, waiting for a movement that never came. The desert was quiet except for coyotes in the distance. When he turned to check on her, Newell was still under his coat, curled near the saddle, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She looked younger in sleep, her face stripped of the sharp suspicion it when awake. Jonas stood slowly, testing his leg before putting full weight on it. The limp was worse in the morning, the cold stiffening the old wound. He worked through it, feeding branches into the fire, then walked to the creek bed half a mile down to fill the canteen. He moved quickly, knowing she shouldn't be left alone long. He kept thinking about what would happen if someone from the town followed the tracks. He hadn't seen anyone on the trail the night before, but men with hate in their gut didn't always need much of a reason to come looking. When he returned, she was awake, sitting upright, one hand pulling his coat tight around her. Her eyes tracked him the whole way in, tense until she saw it was him. Jonas noted the look, fear sharpened into readiness. She was prepared to run or fight even in a state. He respected that. He crouched by the fire, poured water into a tin, and passed it to her. She drank slowly this time, careful not to spill. He noticed her arm again, the swelling worse than the night before. The cloth he had tied held, but it would not last long. He needed a proper splint. "You'll need to keep it still," Jonas said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but steady. "Can't risk it healing wrong." Her gaze didn't leave him. "Why help me?" The words were quiet, but they carried weight. She hadn't asked it the night before, though he had seen the question in her eyes. Now she wanted the truth. Jonas hesitated, shifting his weight. He could have brushed it aside, told her it didn't matter, but she deserved more than silence. "Because I've heard voices before and didn't answer. I couldn't live with that again." He kept his eyes on the fire as he said it. She studied him as though weighing the words, then gave a single nod. No thanks, no softening, but she let the question rest. He worked on a splint, cutting branches to size and binding them with strips from his bedroll. When he touched her arm again, she flinched, biting back a sound. "Hold still," he said, not unkindly, and she did. His hands were steady, practiced from years of tending wounds in the field. When he finished, he saw sweat on her brow, but also relief. She tested the weight of it carefully, then let her shoulders ease. Afterward, he gave her beans from the pot, and this time she ate slower, keeping her eyes on him as if trying to decide what kind of man he was. Jonas said little, focusing on his work. He knew she was studying every move, how he kept his rifle within reach, how he scanned the ridge more than once, how his limp didn't stop him from moving like a man still ready for trouble. When he was done, she spoke again, her voice firmer now. "They said I stole corn," she muttered, her voice flat. She looked down at her hands as she spoke. "I went to the storeroom to ask for scraps. They refused. That night, sacks were torn. They blamed me." She raised her eyes then, locking on his. "I took nothing." Jonas held her stare, knife still in his hand. "I believe you." He meant it. He had seen enough false blame laid at her people's feet to know the truth without proof. She seemed startled at his certainty, as though she expected doubt, even from the man who had pulled her from the well. She lowered her eyes to the fire, but not before he caught the flicker of something, gratitude, or perhaps relief. The day stretched on, and Jonas tended to his horse, checked his rifle, and set traps near the creek. Neil sat quietly for a long time, then began to move around camp, using her good arm to stack wood and clear stones. He saw the effort it cost her, but he didn't stop her. Work steadied the mind, and he knew she needed to feel something other than helplessness. By late afternoon, the camp looked different, not much, but enough a cleared space, a steadier fire, water stored in a pot. She sat down across from him, her hair falling loose around her face, and for the first time, her eyes softened. "You could have left me there," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Jonas gave a short nod. "I didn't." That night, as the fire burned low again, she shifted closer to its heat. The desert chill had settled in. He laid his blanket wide, motioning once. She hesitated, pride holding her back, then sat beside him. They didn't speak, but when her shoulder brushed his arm, Jonas didn't move away. He stared into the flames, knowing the decision he had made was no small thing. He hadn't meant to take anyone into his life again. Yet here she was, wrapped in his coat, her breathing steady beside him, and he knew there was no turning back. Morning came with a grey sky, the air cooler than the day before. Jonas rose before the fire had gone out, feeding it with dry wood until flames caught again. He moved slowly, his limp more pronounced after sleeping on the ground, but he kept his step steady. When he turned back, Nyor was already awake, sitting upright, the coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She had not slept deeply, he could tell by the tightness around her eyes. She tried to stand, bracing herself on her good arm. Jonas saw it before it happened. Her legs buckled, her balance gone. He stepped forward quickly, catching her under the arms before she hit the ground. Her body tensed at his grip, pride stiffening her back, but she didn't push him away. She was too weak. Jonas lowered her onto a flat stone, the fire, his expression calm, though inside he felt the knot of worrying tighten. "You shouldn't push it," he said. His tone was firm but even. She kept her eyes fixed on the fire, her jaw set, breathing sharp through her nose. He recognized it, pride cut by humiliation. He had felt it himself too many times after the musket ball in his thigh left him limping for life. He crouched down beside her, speaking quieter. "Your body needs time. Walking now will break you worse." She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked toward him. He saw in them the fight, her refusal to be helpless, her fear of depending on a man she barely knew. To ease the weight of the silence, Jonas set about boiling water in the tin, dropping in strips of dried venison. The smell rose slowly, filling the camp with something solid. He placed the cup in her hand when it was ready. "Drink. It'll keep you steady." While she drank, Jonas thought of the town again. He knew listeners might ask, why hadn't the sheriff been told? Why hadn't anyone stopped those men from throwing her down the well? He had his answer ready, because he had seen it too often. The law in towns like that served the loudest voices, not the quiet ones. The sheriff, if he knew at all, would look the other way. To them, an Apache woman was no more than trouble, an easy scapegoat when corn went missing. That was why Jonas hadn't carried her back. He didn't need to test it. He already knew. After the meal, he began checking the traps he had set the day before. Nyor tried to rise again, slower this time. Jonas watched from the corner of his eye, not moving to stop her. She took 3 careful steps, swaying but holding upright, a good arm gripping a branch she had found for balance. She stood there a long moment, breathing hard, then lowered herself back to sit. Jonas returned with a rabbit from the traps, setting it down near the fire without comment. Her small effort to walk had told him what he needed. She wasn't giving up. While he skinned the rabbit, she finally spoke. "They said I stole corn," she muttered, her voice flat. She looked down at her hands as she spoke. "I went to the storeroom to ask for scraps. They refused. That night, sacks were torn. They blamed me. She raised her eyes then, locking on his. "I took nothing." Jonas held her stare, his knife still in his hand. "I told you already. I believe you." His tone didn't waver. She searched his face as if testing for a crack, some sign of doubt. She found none. She looked away quickly, but he caught the faint shift in her shoulders, the smallest easing of tension. As the day warmed, Jonas showed her how to keep the splint steady, how to hold her arm against her side when she walked. She listened, her eyes following every move. At midday, when he poured water over the cloth to cool the swelling, his fingers brushed against her skin. She flinched at the touch, not from pain, but from something else. He didn't pull back, only steadied the cloth and tied it tighter. Her breathing caught, then smoothed. By evening, the camp carried a new rhythm. She fetched wood with her good hand, awkward but determined. While Jonas cooked, he caught her glancing at him now and then, studying the scar on his cheek, the limp when he shifted weight, the quiet way he moved. She was measuring him, he realized, deciding if he was truly different from the men who had left her to die. When the fire dimmed that night, the cold pressed in again. Jonas laid out his blankets as before. She hesitated longer this time, pride fighting need, but finally lowered herself onto the blanket beside him. Her shoulder brushed his arm once more. Neither moved away. She pulled the coat tighter, and Jonas kept his eyes on the fire, though he felt the warmth of her leaning close. He knew what listeners would wonder. Would he leave her when she could stand? When her strength returned, the thought crossed his mind too, but he felt the answer settle in him with more certainty than he liked. He had carried her from the well. He had bound her wounds. And now, sitting shoulder to shoulder in silence, he knew leaving was no longer a choice he would make. The next morning broke clear, the sky a pale blue as the desert cooled from the night. Jonas stirred the fire back to life with practiced movements, his shoulders rolling stiff from sleep. He had gotten used to waking to nothing but silence. But now there was another sound, her steady breathing, a faint cough, the rustle of cloth as she shifted beneath his coat. Nyor sat up slowly, her hair tangled and dark around her face, her injured arm cradled close. She tried to push the discomfort from her mind, but he could see the tension cut across her brow. Jonas passed her a tin cup of water, then bread softened in the broth from last night's rabbit. She ate carefully, trying to use both hands out of habit before realizing again that she could not. He noticed the flicker of frustration, the set of her jaw, as she forced herself to continue with only her good hand. To ease her pride, he didn't comment, just cut his own bread one-handed, showing her it could be done without shame. She caught him doing it, her eyes narrowing, but she said nothing. When the meal was done, she stood again, steadier than the day before, though her steps were slow. Jonas followed her movements with a careful eye. She went to the creek, filled the pot, and carried it back against her hip. The water sloshed, wetting her dress, but she did not falter. Jonas felt something shift watching her. The way she fought against her weakness, the way she refused to stay seated when her body begged her to. Later, while he mended the strap of his saddle, she came to sit across from him, her gaze fixed on his hands, rough and scarred, threading leather with precise motions. After a long silence, she spoke. "You were a soldier." He paused, then gave a slow nod. "A scout, army years back." His voice was flat, not inviting questions, but her eyes pressed for more. "You kill?" she asked quietly, not with accusation, but with blunt curiosity. Jonas tightened the strap and looked at her directly. "Yes, to many." The words came out low, heavy with memory. She didn't look away, only studied him with the same steady gaze she had held at the fire. Then she nodded once, as if the answer explained something she had already suspected. She did not ask again. She reached for his sleeve suddenly, holding the edge where it had torn near the shoulder. With her good hand, she pulled a needle and thread from the small pouch at her waist. He hadn't noticed it before, tucked beneath the folds of her dress. Slowly, awkwardly, with one arm, she began stitching. Her fingers trembled, her motions uneven, but she worked until the cloth held. Jonas sat still, watching her concentration. the way she pressed her lip between her teeth as she pulled the thread tight. When she finished, she handed it back without a word. "Good work," Jonas said quietly, genuine. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away, but he caught the faint lift in her expression, a small pride breaking through the exhaustion. Through the afternoon, they worked side by side without planning it. Jonas set new traps. She gathered mesquite pods for the fire. He cleaned his rifle. She washed the cooking tin at the creek. Their movements fit together in a rhythm, not through talk, but through watching and responding. Each time she struggled with her arm, Jonas moved as if to help, but she shook her head, forcing herself to finish. He let her, understanding she needed to hold on to what strength she had left. That evening, as the fire burned strong, Noor shifted closer than before, her shoulder nearly against his. She hesitated, then placed her hand lightly on his. Her skin was warm, the touch brief at first, then steady. Jonas didn't move away. He turned his hand, so their palms met, his fingers resting against hers. The silence between them carried more than words could. She leaned against him after, her head resting against his chest. For the first time, Jonas allowed himself to breathe deep, feeling the weight of another person pressed to him, not in battle, not in grief, but in quiet trust. His mind flicked back to the well, to the moment he had almost walked away. He knew now he never could have. As the night settled and her breathing slowed against him, Jonas realized the camp no longer felt like a place for just one man. Her presence had changed it, and though no promises had been spoken, he felt the truth settle heavy and certain. He had tied his life to hers the moment he pulled her from the dark. The night stretched long, the fire burning down to embers, the desert wind carrying grit across the camp. Jonas lay with his back to the saddle, Noor leaning against him, her breathing light and steady. He had grown used to silence, but this was different, the kind that carried warmth instead of emptiness. For years, he had known only the weight of his own thoughts, the echo of old battles, the names of men long gone. Now there was another heartbeat close to his, another presence filling the space that had been hollow for too long. When dawn came, the world was hushed. The sky was a pale gold. Jonas rose quietly, not to wake her, and stoked the fire until it caught again. He boiled water for coffee, the bitter smell filling the camp. He glanced back at her as she stirred awake, her eyes opening slowly, weary at first. He felt a familiar guardedness soften as his gaze settled on her. For the first time, he saw something in her eyes that was not suspicion or pride, but a tentative, genuine trust. She shifted, attempting to move her injured arm, and a hiss of pain escaped before she could stop it. Jonas knelt beside her, checking the bandage. "The swelling has gone down some," he said, his voice steady. "You'll be able to use it again in time." She studied him, her voice quiet. "You know how to heal." "Had to learn," he replied. "The army didn't send doctors into the field. We patched each other up or we died." His words were simple, yet Noor heard the unspoken pain beneath them, the years of watching too many not make it. She did not press for details, but her eyes lingered on him, as if weighing the heavy toll he carried. That day, the routine of their lives resumed. Jonas checked his traps and skinned a rabbit. Noor insisted on helping more, gathering wood and grinding beans with her good hand. She moved slowly, but he allowed it. Every small task she completed seemed to give her a little more strength. At one point, she stumbled while carrying water from the creek, nearly dropping the pot. Jonas caught it with one hand before it spilled, steadying her with the other. She froze in his grasp, their faces close, her breath sharp against his chin. For a moment, neither moved. Then she stepped back, her cheeks flushed, clutching the coat tighter around her. Jonas said nothing, but the moment lingered between them. By evening, the air had grown cool again. Jonas sharpened his knife, while she sat opposite him, sewing another tear in his coat. She worked slowly, her head bent, strands of hair falling across her cheek. He watched her for longer than he should have, until she looked up and caught his eye. This time, she did not look away. As the fire burned low, she moved closer to him, their shoulders touching. She turned, her face close to his, and he felt her hand brush against his chest, a light but deliberate touch. His breath caught, but he held his composure. Her eyes searched his, asking without words if it was safe to cross this boundary. Jonas, who had been scarred by years of silence, found his answer not in speech, but in action. He lowered his head, and their lips met. The kiss was cautious at first, the firelight casting their faces in a warm glow. She pressed into him, her good hand resting against his jaw. Jonas held her carefully, as if afraid she might break. When they parted, her forehead rested against his, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. For the first time since he had pulled her from the well, he saw her without fear. Jonas sat back slowly, his voice rough and low. "I won't take what isn't freely given." She opened her eyes, meeting his with a clarity that cut through the night. "I stay because I choose," she whispered. Her words were heavy with meaning, settling in him deeper than any vow. That night, they shared the blanket without hesitation. She curled against him, his arm held gently around her waist. The campfire burned low and the desert was quiet. For the first time in years, Jonas allowed himself to rest without one eye open. The presence beside him was no longer a burden, but a promise. The next morning, a sharp wind pushed dust across the camp. Jonas rose early, moving quietly to check the traps near the creek. His body felt lighter than it had in months, though he would never admit it aloud. When he returned, Nure was tending the fire, her good hand steady as she stirred a pot of beans. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and for the first time, she did not tense up, expecting trouble. That simple change told him how far they had come, but peace never lasted long in places like this. By midday, Jonas knew they couldn't hide in the hills forever. He needed ammunition, flour, salt supplies that would force him back into town. Nure saw it, too. "If you go back," she said quietly as they ate, "they will see me with you. They will hate it." Her voice was flat, but beneath it lay a fear she tried to hide. Jonas met her gaze across the fire. "If I go back, I won't leave you here alone, and I won't hide you." His tone was calm but final. He had already made his choice. She looked away, chewing slowly, but he caught a flicker in her eyes, part worrying, part something else he couldn't name. That afternoon, Jonas saddled the horse and helped her up carefully, her injured arm cradled against her side. They rode down toward the settlement, the dry road stretching into view. Nure's body tensed as the first buildings came into sight, the memory of being dragged to the well still too fresh. Jonas kept his hand near the rifle slung across his back, his jaw set. When they reached the trading post, the street fell silent. The men standing outside shifted, their eyes cutting from Nure to Jonas. One spat into the dust. Another muttered something about mixed blood. Jonas ignored them, tying the horse and leading her inside. He bought flour, cartridges, and coffee without haggling, his tone short but steady. Nure stayed close, her eyes downcast, but her posture straight. When they stepped out, 3 men blocked their way, faces he recognized from the well's edge the night he found her. Their expressions were tight, their mouths curled in contempt. The tallest stepped forward, his hand resting near the grip of his revolver. "You took what wasn't yours," he said, nodding toward Nure. "Best turn her loose before more trouble comes." Jonas felt the old heat rise in his chest, the kind he had fought to bury 4 years. He shifted slightly, squaring his stance, his limp hidden by the weight of his posture. His voice was low but sharp. "I pulled her from the well because leaving her there was murder. She stays with me now. Anyone with a quarrel can speak plainly." The street went silent. The man's eyes flicked to Jonas's rifle, then to the cold, steady resolve in his face. For a moment, the tension tightened like a drawn bow. Then the man spat again and stepped back. The others followed, muttering under their breath, but not drawing their weapons. Jonas didn't move until they had turned away. Nure's hand gripped his coat tightly as they mounted the horse again, her eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't need her to speak to know what she felt. Shame from being accused, fear of what might still come. He briefly covered her hand with his own, grounding her without words. They rode back into the hills without incident, but Jonas knew the matter wasn't settled. The men hadn't forgotten. The town would whisper louder now, and eyes would follow. He knew others might wonder why he didn't take her further away from the settlement altogether. The truth was simple. His supplies, his work, and his known ground were all here. Moving meant starting from nothing again. But more than that, he wasn't running anymore. He had made his choice the moment he pulled her from the well. Back at camp, Nyor sat quiet for a long time, staring at the fire. Finally, she looked up. "You risked your life," she said softly. Her tone was not an accusation, but carried a mix of confusion and gratitude. Jonas held her gaze, answering with the only truth he had. "I don't walk away. Not from you." That night, she shifted closer under the blanket, her body pressed against his without hesitation. Her breathing steadied as she leaned into him, and Jonas felt the weight of what had begun. It was no longer a choice made in the heat of a moment, but a bomb tested against the judgment of others. He knew trouble would come again, but he also knew he wouldn't face it alone. The night after their return from town was restless. Jonas sat awake longer than usual, the firelight cutting across his face as Nyor slept beside him, her head resting against his chest. He listened to every sound, the crack of a branch, the cry of a coyote, the faint whistle of the wind. The encounter at the trading post hadn't ended the matter. He knew those men, their kind, didn't forget. Sooner or later, they would test his resolve. That thought stayed with him, but so did the memory of her hand gripping his coat in front of the whole town, refusing to let go. At dawn, Nyor stirred first, wincing as she shifted her arm. The swelling had begun to ease, but she was still in pain. Jonas helped her rewrap the splint, his hands steady and deliberate. She watched him closely, her expression a mix of gratitude and discomfort. He spoke quietly as he worked. "It's healing. You'll have your strength back in time." She gave a small nod, her lips pressed tight. One might wonder what Nyor truly wanted in this arrangement. Was she staying because she had no choice, or because trust was forming? The answer became clearer that morning when she asked unprompted, "Why do you live alone?" Her voice carried genuine curiosity, not just suspicion. Jonas paused, the question cutting deeper than he expected. He had avoided saying it aloud for years. He met her eyes and answered with plain truth. "Because I buried everyone I cared for. A wife, a child. The war took the rest. It's easier to keep to myself than to watch more people die." His words came out raw, stripped of anything but fact. Nyor looked at him for a long time. "You saved me," she said softly. "So maybe it's not easier anymore." Her words were not meant as comfort, they were simple and direct, but they lodged in him deeper than anything had in years. That afternoon, heavy, low rain clouds gathered over the ridges. Jonas pulled a canvas across the lean-to, while Nyor gathered stones to steady the fire. They worked side by side, their movement smooth, with no need for orders. When the rain began, they sheltered together, the sound of drops striking hard against the canvas. Nyor sat close, the damp air curling strands of her hair against her cheek. Jonas reached up without thinking, brushing one away. She didn't flinch. The storm pressed them closer. Her hand found his, resting there, her fingers curling slowly around his rough palm. The quiet stretched long, filled only by the rush of rain. When she leaned toward him, Jonas met her halfway, their lips meeting in the half-light. This time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was firm, searching. When she pulled back, her eyes held his with certainty. "I'm not afraid when I'm with you," she whispered. He drew her against him, his arms steady at her waist, careful of her injury. They stayed like that until the storm passed, the air cooling. The desert washed clean outside. As night came, the fire burned strong again. Nyor sat close, her body pressed into his side. She spoke in fragments about her people, how raids had scattered them, how hunger had driven her toward the town that had betrayed her. Jonas listened, not pressing for details, only offering his presence. When she faltered, he rested his hand lightly over hers, grounding her. That night, under the blanket they now shared without question, their closeness deepened. The space between them no longer carried suspicion or pride, but a conscious choice. Her hand traced the scar on his chest, her breath warm against his neck. He held her carefully, with a restraint born not of doubt, but of respect. Every movement was deliberate, every touch an unspoken promise. For years, Jonas had thought himself hollow, surviving only because his body refused to quit. Now, with her pressed against him, he felt the weight of something new. Responsibility, yes, but also belonging. The storm outside had passed, but he knew the one beyond their camp still waited. And when it came, he was ready to meet it, not alone. The morning after the storm was crisp, the desert air washed clean, and the sky stretched wide and pale. Jonas rose early, his movements deliberate as he checked the traps and saddled the horse. He felt something shift inside him, a quiet certainty that the time for hiding had passed. Nior sat near the fire, wrapping his coat tighter around her frame. She watched him closely, reading his intent before he spoke. "They won't leave this alone," Jonas said evenly as he crouched near the fire. "Men like that don't forget. If they see you alive with me, they'll push harder." He didn't raise his voice. It wasn't a threat, just a fact. Nia's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. "Then we face them," she said, her words quiet but steady. For a woman who had been left to die in a well, they carried immense weight. Jonas studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. By midday, they rode back toward the town, dust rising behind the horses' hooves. Jonas carried his rifle slung but ready, his revolver heavy at his side. Nya rode in front, wrapped in his coat, her back straight despite the stiffness in her arm. Heads turned as they entered the main road. Whispers followed. The Apache woman alive, the quiet scout bringing her in plain sight. The same three men who had blocked them before stood outside the saloon. Their eyes narrowed when they saw her. One stepped forward, spitting into the dust. "We told you to turn her loose." Jonas dismounted slowly and measured his steps, his limp not hiding the steadiness in his stance. His voice cut through the silence. "She stays with me. You try to take her again, you answer to me." The man's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Jonas was faster. His revolver cleared the holster before the other's fingers touched leather. The street froze. Jonas's voice stayed level, the barrel of his gun aimed without a shake. "You've already shown what kind of men you are. Leave her be, or next time I won't stop at words." The moment stretched long, the crowd watching, no one daring to move. Finally, the man's eyes faltered. He stepped back, muttering curses, but not drawing his weapon. The others followed, their bravado broken under the weight of Jonas's gaze. The town slowly resumed its noise, but the point had been made. Jonas holstered his revolver, then offered his hand to Nior as she slid down from the saddle. She gripped him steadily, her eyes holding his. In that look, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that what had been survival was now a choice. They finished their business quickly, buying what they needed, ignoring the stares. When they left town, no one stopped them. The road back to the hills felt different, freer, as though the weight of others' judgment had been pushed aside. Back at camp, Jonas began to build more than just a fire. He cut logs, stacking them carefully. Nior watched, puzzled, until he spoke. "This place was meant for passing through, but I'm done drifting." He paused, glancing at her. "I want it to be ours." Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. She walked to him, her hand resting over his on the log. "You saved me from the well," she said quietly. "Now you give me a place." Jonas nodded once, his voice rough. "Not just a place, a life." That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridges, they sat together near the fire, their shoulders touching, her head against his chest. There were no crowds, no whispers, no men waiting to strike, only the steady rhythm of two people who had chosen to stay. For Jonas, it was the first time in years the silence felt whole instead of empty. For Nior, it was the first time she belonged without fear. The well had been meant to bury her, but instead, it had tied their lives together. When the fire burned low, Jonas reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple leather band he had carved in the days before. He slipped it gently onto her finger. "You're mine, if you want it that way." Her answer came not with words, but with the firm press of her lips against his. She stayed there, her breath warm against him, her hand tight in his. The desert stretched wide around them, but the hollow spaces inside were gone. For the first time, neither of them had to walk alone.